Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. So just for everyone's information, I have started recording this meeting. So thank you everyone for being here and welcome to this webinar on navigating advisor and advisee relationships. So this is our final professional development event of the semester with GSG. And today we have Dr. Debra Charlesworth, who is Assistant Dean for Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs, and Dr. Anna McClatchy, who is Manager of Student Outreach and Retention, for a conversation on advisor and advisee relationships. So the way this is going to work is Dr. Charlesworth and Dr. McClatchy are going to talk for about 20 minutes, if I'm correct, and then we'll have some time for a Q&A session. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my slides so that Dr. Charlesworth, you can share yours, and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you for having us here today. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. So we're going to talk about navigating that relationship. Thank you for the introduction, so we can move on right away here. But we're going to talk first of all about how we want to set expectations with our advisor a little bit. This is a little bit of a review from orientation, but I think it's important to kind of remember that this is the foundational piece of building that relationship. Having a difficult conversation is what Anna will talk about, and then we'll close with sort of a few additional resources and learning opportunities. So as a disclaimer, we are assuming that your advisor is a reasonable person acting with positive intent. And I would say that the majority of our faculty certainly are doing that. Even though you may not see it that way sometimes, there may be modeling behavior that worked for them in their professional relationship, and it worked for them to get them where they are, and they're doing the very best that they can to help you be the best person you can be in your graduate career. There are some relationships that are toxic or abusive. We have heard of those. We know they exist. And if that is your case, changing advisors may be your best option. Some of the tips and tools we give you are going to assume that your advisor is, again, acting in a reasonable way and professionally and with positive intent. So if that's not your case, let's talk about that separately and try and help you out. So let's talk about setting expectations. And when we think about expectations, there's really two different sorts. We want to start by just defining those briefly. So explicit expectations are the ones that are clearly stated, either verbally or in written form. So you've emailed your advisor to say, okay, I came to this meeting. I understand that I'm supposed to do experiment X by date Y. Is that correct? And your advisor goes, yes, that's correct. So that's an explicit expectation. You check it for understanding. You verify that it's what you wanted. Now, these can still cause conflict if you don't like them. Doesn't mean that they're not going to cause some ripples in the waves sometimes, but we can deal with conflict by having that difficult conversation. In orientation, we talk about using that interest-based approach. So that's something you might remember back to your time when we went through that. Implicit expectations are the ones that generally get us a little bit more in trouble in the sense that they're not stated and they're rarely understood. So, what didn't you understand about what I didn't tell you? So somebody expects you to do something, but they never tell you. They expect you to know it. You don't meet that expectation. And then all of a sudden your advisor or anybody in any kind of relationship is saying, well, why didn't you do this thing that I was expecting you to do that I never told you about? And that can cause some difficult conversations to occur. Those are going to cause your conflict at an unknown point at some future point that we don't know about. So if we think about expectations, the explicit ones I've shown here in blue, and we can have two different sorts. We can have the jointly set expectations where you've talked about them, you've crafted them, you've decided on them. And then we have the unilateral ones. And those are some of the university rules, policies, procedures. Maybe your advisor just has a rule in the lab or a rule in their arrangement that this is the way things are always going to be. And there's really no room sometimes to negotiate some of those. Implicit ones are always unilateral because those are the ones that somebody else has put on you but never told you about. So those are always the unilateral. And I put those in red because they're the ones that kind of cause, the trouble. They're sort of the angry point sometimes, or the difficult point in the relationship. So one of your things as a graduate student is to think about how can you maximize those explicit expectations that you set jointly with your advisor so that you can minimize some of those implicit ones. So having those conversations ahead of time about things that you expect could cause an issue down the road. Maybe you have some travel planned or you need to go somewhere for a family trip. Maybe you have the expectation of going on a co-op for a semester or two and you're a PhD student. When can you do that so it minimizes the disruption to your research progress, but also meets your expectations that you had for graduate school? All those sorts of things that you think might cause a disruption, how can you kind of manage those and maximize the jointly set things, minimize the implicit ones? So just to kind of briefly review, these are some expectations that every advisor is going to expect of you, and they may not tell you these things. These are things we again talk about in our orientation program, but you should be performing work in a timely and responsible manner. And most especially important is if you are funded, if you're a GTA or a GRA, your assistantship should be treated like a real job because that's what your advisor is going to expect. Faculty are going to expect that you ask questions, that you set some of your expectations for your training, that you maintain good research records and you follow the best practices in your field. And if you don't know what those are, that you again ask questions. So these are the things that faculty are definitely going to expect from you, whether they tell you or not. On the flip side, these are things you can expect from your advisor. And if you're not getting some of these things, they may be assuming that you already know them, or they may, want you to ask questions because they just kind of forgot to tell you sometimes. Advisors can be absent-minded sometimes. So you can expect that your advisor provides you training and set goals and manages staff time and equipment, that they tell you how they're going to evaluate you and your progress, that they set a good example, and that they tell you how to get credit in publications. These are things you can expect. Now, to kind of give you some of these unilateral ones that are explicit expectations, these are some of the university expectations of you. When you're enrolled in coursework, any credits, whether it's research or courses, every credit that you're enrolled in, you're expected to be averaging 3.5 hours a week of work in and out of the classroom. Full-time is 9 credits. That means you're averaging, let's just say 32 hours to round that up. That could be a mixture of coursework and research credits. So for every 9 credits you're enrolled in, that's about how much you should be working on average every week. If you're also a GTA or a GRA, those positions are 20 hours a week in addition to your registration. So that way, if you are a full-time GTA or GRA, your expectation from your faculty is that you're working an average of 50 hours a week on both of those parts of your experience as a graduate student. So if you're not doing that, if you're falling short, then you might need to raise your level of effort. If you're consistently well above that, then that's not good behavior either. And that's a conversation that needs to happen with your advisor about your workload and your expectations for working. So one of the tools that's available to you to help you with setting those expectations is what we call an individual development plan. And in that plan, there are columns for you to talk about what are things you expect. And there's a column for you, your advisor, to reflect on how can they help you meet that expectation. And so one of the things that we would really encourage you to take a look at is an IDP to help work with your advisor to help guide those conversations before you kind of get into that difficult situation so that you can have those expectations set. And there's lots of templates available on the website. The MyTech IDP, the Michigan Tech template, is one that was developed with faculty at Michigan Tech and is customizable for you in your work. I also want to just close with saying, it's also important for you to manage your expectations. Every advisor-advisee relationship is different. Don't expect yours to be like anyone else's. It's just like a marriage or a friendship or a partnership. They're all different, and there's no good or bad. Everyone's kind of on a spectrum of differentness. So don't compare that to somebody else's. Your difficult advisor could be somebody else's dream advisor. And if you're having that difficult advisor, this is an opportunity for you maybe to learn from that experience, to maybe gain some tips and tricks on how to deal with that supervisor or advisor who's a little bit more challenging, and also learn when it's time to move on. When is this just not going to work out? And that's the same thing again with a relationship. You know, when do you stick with that partner for life? And when do you decide this isn't the relationship for me and I want to switch to a different partner? And then reflect on your role. Are you doing everything that's expected of you? And if you are, then it's again time to look at the other side of that equation, but make sure that you're holding up your end of the bargain before you kind of go into some of these conversations. And that's just kind of my quick expectations discussion in terms of how to set the foundation for a relationship. And Anna's going to now talk about those difficult conversations when things aren't working out.
Thanks, Deb. So we recognize that sometimes the setting of expectations don't always go as planned, and that means we have to have a difficult conversation. And this is a good skill to go ahead and practice because you're likely going to have a difficult conversation after you leave Michigan Tech, like we've said, with a spouse or with an employer or somebody else. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So we want to walk through a couple of the steps. So how do you get started in having a difficult conversation? Our first suggestion is to plan for the meeting. This gives both parties time to plan ahead. Surprising your advisor in their office or anything with a difficult conversation may not always go as planned for either side. And so you want to have time to plan your questions that you want to have ready for your advisor, but you also want to give your advisor the due process and plan ahead so that they can be prepared to have that conversation with you. You also want to set the tone for the meeting. You've asked for this meeting, and so you need to make sure that you're setting the tone in a calm manner. And it's always good to start with appreciation for your advisor's time to meet with you and to have this conversation with you. And then review the purpose of the meeting in that time frame as well, that you want to discuss XYZ and you want to appreciate them for the time that they're taking and that they are helping you in some ways also. And then we want to move on to the housekeeping items. So take a few minutes to catch up and say like, hey, this piece is going really well. This piece is going really well in the lab. And then you can lead into that more difficult conversation. This is also a good place to let them know if you plan to take any notes or record the conversation so that you can make sure you're having those clear expectations moving forward. So next, we're going to have the conversation. And this is, I think, is one of the most difficult pieces for everyone to have, is really naming the issue and being direct with that issue. And part of that is we want to name the behavior and not attack someone's character. So, you might go in, and an example we like to use is their expectations are insane. Okay, well, insane is a very loaded word that we might not want to use in that difficult conversation because that's just going to lead to an elevated conversation. But we may want to use some neutral language or reframing, and we want to name a behavior. That say like, hey, it seems that our expectations are not matching up. Can we discuss how to have a better expectation of myself and of you in the lab or my other research expectations? And then build some trust. Talk about your positive or shared experiences that you've had with your advisor, that you really are enjoying this one piece and you think that it's going really well. And we don't want to make assumptions that the other person knows about these things or that you feel this way, because they don't know how you feel unless you let them know how you are feeling in this moment. And so you want to ask open-ended questions, and this is to gather information because you really want to see what that other person's perspective is. And a good way to do this is, can you tell me more? That's one that I like to use with students as well. Can we just tell me more? It's not really about being nosy. It's about gathering the most information so that you can make an informed resolution to your issue by getting both perspectives from either side. You also want to provide feedback, like I was talking about when you're talking about how this is impacting you, and using I statements to articulate your feelings. That maybe their behaviors are making you feel frustrated or angry or upset, but those are your feelings and they aren't in control of your feelings, and they won't know those feelings unless you articulate them to you. You should refer to facts when possible, and that's discussing some of those expectations that you hopefully have set before, but if not, you can talk about how, hey, we agreed that by this week we would have some feedback so I can move forward. Referring back to those facts are really helpful when you're having this difficult conversation. And really try not to leave things unsaid just because it might feel awkward, or you don't want to say it because you think they might react poorly. You don't want to leave that unsaid, because this is part of having the difficult conversation, is putting those things out on the table. So we would like to come to a resolution, but we'll talk about maybe some options for that if that can't be had. So discuss more than one resolution. You don't always want to go with the first thing that you've come up with, because maybe that's not the best choice. So discuss more than one option when you're discussing a solution to your problems. And you're going to need to be willing to compromise. It is unlikely that in any difficult conversation you will get everything that you want out of the situation. So you're going to have to be willing to compromise somewhere. And where are you going to be willing to compromise? And follow up. So review that resolution and ensure that others are on the same page. It's just like setting those expectations that we talked about in the beginning. Putting this in an email saying, hey, I'm just recapping that we are on the same page, that I'm going to do XYZ, and you're going to give me feedback or other things at this time, and be specific with those dates and facts so that if you need to refer back to them in the future, you can do so. Go on to the next one. And some of the questions that help us to problem solve are listed here. And these obviously are not a comprehensive list, but what might work for you or for us? What's the resolution you were seeking? Because that's a good way to identify what the other person might be thinking. What can we do to help resolve this issue? What other things might we try? What would make this idea more workable for you or for us? So what's some next steps if the conversation wasn't productive? You can talk to a supervisor like the graduate program director, the department chair, or college dean, if you need to move on to that next level because of the conversation. Or this would honestly be after multiple conversations are not coming to a good resolution. You can also consult with Dr. Charlesworth or I, Dr. Charlesworth or I, and we can just provide some guidance and feedback about the situation as a third party and get some outside perspective. We also have Ombuds, which is a confidential resource, and we'll give you that information in just a second if you would like to use a confidential resource instead. And then a facilitated dialogue may be another option if you really need somebody else in the room when you're having that conversation to help navigate both sides. Go ahead, Deb.
Yep. So we do have some resources here for you in case you weren't aware of these or I didn't know about them, but we do have our Center for Student Health, Mental Health and Wellbeing. That's a mouthful. And that's obviously on the third floor of the administration building in our university. There's an email address. We also have now, My SSP, which is the online counseling resources available as well. So sometimes speaking with the counselor can be very helpful, especially if there's lots of feelings involved and just, anxiety and those sorts of things. They can help with those issues that you might have. Our ombuds is what Anna talked about to start with, is Susanna Peters at the university. That's her email, speters. And there's also a website on the university for ombuds. Susanna is completely and 100% confidential. Anything that you tell her can't go anywhere else. That's what the role of an ombuds is. If you do talk to like myself or Anna, just so that you're aware, for example, there are certain things that if you tell us, we do have an obligation to report them to other people. Most specifically, generally, crimes or Title IX type issues, just in case that's part of your issue. We also have Dial Help, which is a confidential resource in town that's available. And so that's not connected with the university at all. So if you're kind of having those mental health issues and you're not wanting to talk to someone affiliated with the university, that's another option available. Title IX, institutional equity, human resources. And all of these people are trained in conflict resolution, essentially. If you look at the conflict resolution network, you'll see my name on that network, as well as some other people from those other offices above. So, there's lots of people on campus that you can talk to who can help, direct you to the right place, depending on what your concern is, as well as myself or Anna. So if find the person that speaks to you and that can that you feel comfortable with having that conversation, and they'll help you with directing you in the right place. We do have some citations in the presentation. Some of these are based on, some pieces of this are based on some of those different articles. And that's really all the formal stuff we have today for you. So I'll stop sharing the slides now and look forward to your discussion and questions.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, Marina, before we stop recording, Dr. Charlesworth, Dr. McClatchy, can you talk a little bit about the GSG resource that you helped kind of finalize for these kinds of conversations?
Are you talking about the, go ahead, Anna.
Oh, I was just going to ask, are you referring to the difficult conversations workshop we did?
That's one of them, yeah.
Yeah, so we do have a difficult conversations workshop that we did this semester where there's a level 1 and a level 2. And level 1 is a lot about the peer-to-peer conversations that you might need to have in your life. And then the level 2 plays on that power dynamic that you might experience with your advisor and how to have that difficult conversation. And that's, what do we say, like about 2 hours, because we do a case study and when we have everyone role play and go through that, and you know, you get some actual practice, because that's a big part of having a difficult conversation is practicing them. I didn't know if you had other ones that you were thinking of.
I thought there was a document, but I could be wrong.
There is a document that we reviewed and gave some feedback on, but it's a GSG document that I'm not aware of its current status, if it's available for students or not. So that's why we didn't bring that into the conversation.
Okay, no problem, no problem.
Okay.
Right, go ahead, Marina. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that for the Q&A session, we're going to stop recording. And then